I'm happy to. Thank you for that question, because I think all of us should be aware of the fact of what is required by this act when it comes to registering to vote. You have to present identification, correct? But your driver's license, which most people use in the course of business every single day, is not acceptable. What is acceptable is a passport. 50% of Americans do not have a passport. Those who want to obtain it so they can vote will pay $186 and wait 3 or 4 weeks for that to happen. Secondly, you can use a birth certificate, but any person who has changed their name as a result of a marriage or a hyphenated relationship has to find not only their birth certificate, but some correction of it to prove that they're eligible to register to vote. It's estimated that 9% of the voters in America do not have the identification required by this bill. It means ultimately that those people will not be voting. And I think that is the ultimate goal of this administration.
One last question. Those are all matters that could be addressed by amendments to the bill itself if we get on the bill, correct?
When's the last time we amended
For which I
a bill?
would think there would
Mr.
be
Chair,
broad
parliamentary
support.
inquiry. Do we have a quorum present?
We do have a quorum, but
Thank you.
I think we ought to let Lee shortly speak on this,
Yeah,
then we'll vote.
I'm happy to report to my dear friend and colleague, Senator Durbin from Illinois. You're in luck. We've taken care of that. When you read the bill, what you'll discover is that we've made special accommodation for those who don't have documentation, for those who can't find their birth certificate, maybe their house burned down, maybe their dog ate it, whatever it is. When all else fails, if you don't have documentation establishing the information on your birth certificate or what would be in a passport or otherwise, the bill contains a provision requiring each state to allow an alternative mechanism by which someone can, by attestation, issue a sworn statement establishing the critical facts underlying their citizenship. It then puts the onus on the state to follow up on that and to determine the authenticity of it. States have access to their own records. States have reciprocity with other states and are able to achieve verification of that. So we've taken care of that problem, and so I'm sure you'll be elated to hear that, and we look forward to having your affirmative vote when we vote on the Save America Act. We took great pains to go out of our way to make sure that no American would be left in the dark.
Well,
this will not cost them a dime, and no one will be excluded if they can't find their documentation.
This is such a scourge on American political scene that in the last 20 years, there have been 24 identified cases of non-Americans trying to vote. 24 people in 20 years. And the president said, we won't consider any other legislation until we consider this bill.
Okay, we'll now consider.
Senator Mike Lee is stepping in and flipping the script on what's usually a Republican talking point. Instead of defending strict voter ID rules, he's raising a red flag about the Save America Act's requirements, and his argument is basically this: the system might be too burdensome. Now think about the example he's using, a passport. We're talking about a document that costs around $186, takes weeks to process, requires paperwork, appointments, and time. And under this framework, that's being treated as a valid form of identification, while something like a driver's license isn't accepted. And that's where Lee's argument lands hard, because a driver's license is what millions of Americans actually use in everyday life. It's accessible, it's common, it's already tied to identity verification. So when you say that's not enough, but a passport is, suddenly this stops sounding like simple verification and starts sounding like a higher barrier than people expected. And then he brings in the second point. And this is where it really gets serious. About 9% of American voters don't have the required identification. 9%. That's not a small fringe group. That's millions of people. So Lee is essentially asking, what happens to them? Because if the goal is election integrity, that's one thing. But if the process to prove eligibility becomes too difficult, too expensive, or too time-consuming, then you're not just verifying voters. You're potentially filtering them out. And that's where this debate flips from abstract policy to real-world impact. Now, here's the tension. On one side, you've got the argument for security. Make sure only eligible citizens vote, protect the system, maintain trust. On the other side, And now even voices like Lee are echoing parts of this. You've got the argument for accessibility. If the barrier is too high, you're not protecting democracy, you're restricting it. And what makes this moment interesting is that Lee isn't rejecting voter ID outright. He's questioning how it's being implemented. That's a different conversation. It's not, should we have ID? It's, what kind of ID is reasonable? Because requiring something like a passport introduces cost barriers, time barriers, bureaucratic hurdles, and those don't hit everyone equally. Rural voters, lower income voters, elderly voters, people without easy access to documentation. They feel that friction more. So now the debate shifts. It's no longer just left versus right. It's becoming a question of design. Can you create a system that is both secure and realistically accessible? Because here's the bottom line. If the rules are too loose, people question legitimacy. If the rules are too strict, people question fairness. And right now, what Mike Lee is doing is highlighting that this balance might be off. Senator Mike Lee is now raising a question that cuts deeper than paperwork or procedures. He's not just asking how the Save America Act works, he's asking what it's really trying to do. And the implication? That the end goal might not just be verification, but limiting who actually gets to vote. Now that's a serious charge, because once you move from this is a flawed system to this is designed to exclude people, you're no longer debating logistics. You're debating the purpose of the law itself. But here's where Lee does something interesting. He doesn't just criticize and walk away. He pivots to solutions. He suggests, if there are concerns, fix them through amendments. That's a different tone. It's not scrap the bill. It's adjust the bill so it works the way it's supposed to. And that brings us to a key detail that's getting less attention than it probably should. The Save America Act actually includes alternative mechanisms for people who don't have standard documentation, things like sworn statements to establish citizenship. Now on paper, that sounds like a safety valve. It's the system saying, okay, if you don't have the documents, there's still a path. But here's the question, and this is where Lee's skepticism comes in. How practical is that path? Because a sworn statement might exist in the law, but how is it verified? How is it processed? How easy is it for someone to actually use? If that process is complicated, intimidating, or inconsistently applied, then technically having an alternative doesn't necessarily mean meaningful access. And that's the gap Lee is pointing to. Because this whole debate is balancing on a razor's edge between two principles: election integrity, making sure only eligible voters participate voter access, making sure eligible voters aren't blocked by the system itself. And when Lee implies that the real goal might be exclusion, what he's doing is challenging whether that balance has tipped too far in one direction. But at the same time, the existence of these alternative mechanisms gives supporters of the bill something to point to. Look, we're not shutting people out. We've built in flexibility. So now the fight becomes less about whether the law has safeguards and more about whether those safeguards actually work in practice. And that's where these policies live or die, not in the text, but in the execution. Because here's the bottom line. If people believe the system is designed to exclude them, trust erodes. If people believe the system is too loose, trust erodes in a different way. And what Lee is doing right now is stepping into that tension and saying, we need to get this right, not just politically, but functionally, because democracy doesn't just depend on rules. It depends on whether people believe those rules are fair, accessible, and applied equally. Senator Mike Lee is coming in strong here, pushing back hard on critics of the Save America Act. And his core argument is this: the system already has the tools to verify voters. We're just formalizing and strengthening it. He's pointing to something that doesn't always get enough attention: state-level verification systems. Every state already maintains records, driver's licenses, voter rolls, social security cross-checks, even reciprocity agreements with other states. So Lee's saying, this isn't some brand new, untested concept. This is infrastructure that already exists. States already know how to confirm identities. They already share data. They already flag inconsistencies. So from his perspective, requiring verification isn't adding chaos. It's adding clarity to a system that's already functioning. And then he goes straight at the biggest criticism. Opponents say voter ID laws could disenfranchise people, make it harder for certain groups to vote, create barriers, introduce cost and complexity. Lee's response? That's simply not true. He argues that under the Save America Act, Americans will not be pushed out of the system. Why? Because there are multiple pathways to verification, not just one rigid requirement. We're talking about existing state records, cross-state verification systems, alternative methods like sworn statements. So in his framing, this isn't about exclusion, it's about confirmation. And then there's the cost argument. Critics say these requirements could force people to spend money on documents, time, travel. Lee pushes back and says the system is designed in a way that doesn't impose new financial burdens. In other words, you don't need to go out and buy something new. You're already in the system. We just verify what's there. Now here's where this gets interesting, because Lee is trying to reframe the entire debate. Instead of, this law might block people from voting, he's saying, this law reflects how voting already works. We're just making it more secure and consistent. That's a big shift. But the tension doesn't disappear, because critics will still ask, what happens if state records are outdated? What if someone falls through the cracks? What if reciprocity systems don't sync perfectly? Because even strong systems can have weak edges. And in something as sensitive as voting, those edges matter. So now you've got two competing realities. Lee's view, the system is robust, interconnected, and capable. This law strengthens trust without harm. Critics' view, even small barriers can have big impacts, and those impacts won't be evenly distributed. And that's where this debate lives, not in whether verification is possible, but in whether it's perfectly reliable for everyone. Because here's the bottom line. If the system works as smoothly as Lee describes, this is about confidence and security. But if there are gaps, even small ones, then the concern becomes access and fairness. And right now, what you're watching is a battle over which version of that system Americans believe is closer to reality.